You're a professional, you're doing professional development, you're looking for answers, you're looking for content, you want to know more about the international landscape for safety. I'm talking to my good mate today, Andrew Barrett from the Safety on Tap podcast and his coaching and consulting company, Fidessa. We're talking all things safety and safety leadership, safety development, safety coaching, and your why. Stay tuned. We were talking about this guy's work, and we're talking about like working for safety. Well, in my words, it'd be like working for safety's sake versus working for an outcome.
Yeah.
You take something away, you take that away, you take some of those things we do away, and it doesn't actually change what's going on.
Yeah, and it's a question of going, what's the purpose? So like there's always an outcome. I mean, most of the work that we do has an outcome. It's just a case of actually going, what is that outcome? So what we were talking about is, you know, we might say there's end of month reporting, for example. That's a part of most management systems and what most good companies ask for. Mm-hmm. The question is what purpose does that serve? So people think that tracking whatever safety indicators you might track in your system actually helps safety, but it's disconnected from actual safety outcomes because that's the stuff that's happening on site with the frontline, people who are actually doing the work. And so if you took away that reporting, would the safety on the front line change? Probably not. Is it still important or is it still relevant or is there still an outcome? Yeah, there is. It's just we need to make sure that we're not kind of kidding ourselves about what the purpose of it is, what the outcome is that we're trying to achieve.
Have you heard me talk about the concept of good ideas shelf?
No.
Like, so you come up with all these great ideas. We've got them all the time.
Where's your great idea shelf?
Well, it's in my office. Like, it should stay in my office and not come out into the business.
Yeah.
I might have the good idea, it might be the bright and shiny thing, but you have these good ideas, let's leave them on the good ideas shelf and get on with business. And like, you know, some of these guys here, like you get the text messages on a Friday night, oh, you know what we should do next week? We should blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, well, some of those things get the green light, particularly with people with autonomy. Yeah. And off they go off on their tangent, but we're not bringing it back to understanding how that's going to get mapped out. Yeah. That's in all aspects of business.
But it's funny when you think about, and I think safety is different to a lot of different aspects of business. So you've probably got a broader view than some of this research that's been done by Drew Ray and Dave Proven at Griffith University, where they looked at those purposes of the work that we do, that we call safety work, and they actually said one of the problems that exists is the asymmetry between the creation of new safety stuff and the removal of safety stuff. So if you think about an audit or an investigation or an inspection or a regulator intervention or a board meeting or anything like that, there's lots of triggers for where we want to feel like we're making progress, and so action comes because of that. We want to show management that we're doing something, or we want to have a corrective action for the whatever. And so then we create this safety work, whatever it is, new procedure, change something, put more people through training, whatever. And so it feels like we're making progress. More safety work leads to more safety. That assumption is probably the biggest flawed assumption. And so we very much find that we add and add and add and add, and then we have these behemoth systems, and you and I have seen many of them and probably contributed to many of them. Yep. And then but then you've got to ask yourself the question, when do we take away?
Absolutely.
And it's very hard. Most people don't ever actually go, oh, we've got a taking away process. Like you talked about your ideation process and going, well, there's gates and filters and decision-making kind of criteria. Whether that's formal or informal doesn't matter. But what about the opposite? Most businesses, especially for safety, don't do that. And you know why?
Too scary.
It's scary. It's like if you take something away from safety, you're not committed to safety. Or if it goes wrong, then they're going to say you took something away and that might have actually had something to do with it. So we're scared.
Yeah, and we end up with Form Friday. Form Friday. You guys heard of Form Friday? It's Form Friday. So it's like today's Form Friday. That's what happens. So if your business has got a culture of Form Friday, you need a taking away process.
Yeah. But almost no one has that. And I think that in the context of management systems, I mean, this work was done specific to safety, but I think that there's some broader learnings that come out of that. And this is very consistent with the work that you guys do, which is saying that systems aren't about the paperwork. It's about the paperwork enabling the process and the outcome. And the taking away bit has to be part of that. That's part of your continuous improvement loop.
Absolutely.
Yeah. 100%. But I've almost never seen it.
You don't see it. You know, that's why we wrote that book, 5 ways to minimise documents, as a downloadable checklist. because it just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It just doesn't exist. Here's a really good case study we've been using here at Best Practice. Pre-start meeting. Everyone's doing it. Maybe it's not getting the outcome, but we're doing it because everybody does it. Well, we're not. But we've moved that into a private, secret Facebook group. So we don't have to stop the whole business to have that meeting.
Yep.
We do a live post. If people are available, we notify them. There's going to be a live post in the business. Run the live meeting. If people are not available, client meeting, family issue, day off, whatever it might be, they can then check back in to Facebook, essentially, because they're following the group. Don't have to be friends on Facebook.
Yeah, but they'll get a notification.
They'll get a notification, the group was live, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
What Facebook gives us is a seen by. Now, the people that audit us are now acknowledging that as an attendance register. There's all the arguments about, well, what if the person didn't actually follow the post or read the post? Well, that's no different to if the person fell asleep in the pre-start meeting.
Yeah.
But
the only computer literate supervisor at the contractor does all the inductions for all the other workers.
100%.
It's all happening all the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So for us, we've got a small step in the right direction.
Yeah.
We can have the conversation later about whether you use Facebook or don't use Facebook or you're a Facebook user, but we've got people in this company who are not Facebook users.
Yeah.
We issue them with an iPhone, we issue them with the Facebook app on that iPhone, and we issue them with a profile.
Yeah.
The only thing in their Facebook account is the company group.
Yeah.
So for them, it's just a button on, it's Facebook, but for them it's just a button on a phone.
Yeah.
You can't find them, you can't discover them on Facebook, they can't get friend requests, none of that sort of stuff, because for their personal privacy, no photos of them. It's just literally just their name and a poop emoji, and that's it. You know, and so then they see that stuff. So we've taken away, and there's other ways to do it, but we've taken away, that bit of paper that you then, well, what do I do with the pre-start? Like, I've got evidence now that everybody was at that meeting or received that communication or whatever. Call it. It's like a read receipt. So it is interesting, but then if you dig down in our management system, you'll find the attendance register is still there.
Yeah.
There's a blank form that you can fill out.
Yeah. And I think it's important. One of the things that I kind of really like about this work that's been done is that, like, none of this is new. So we're having a conversation about it, and we're both going, we've got some stories, right? And I think that everyone listening or watching will actually be able to identify their own examples too of where there's this clutter that exists in your systems. The difference is that if you've actually got a way to think about it and understand where it comes from, then it actually helps you work out how you can avoid it in the first place and then how you can work on it. So that idea of, that example that you said with the pre-starts, that's a really classic example of where that started in one place and then we've just gone, oh, that looks like a good idea over in that industry or that company or whatever. And so that's duplication by industry. And so we're going to duplicate it or we're going to generalise it. So we might actually say, well, we'll do a toolbox talk. And I've seen toolbox talks that have been done in administrative kind of businesses, in white collar kind of contexts. And so what we're doing is we're generalising from one context to an entirely different context. And we think that that's still good safety.
Yeah.
And yet we don't actually ask ourselves the question, well, why did it exist over there? Does it work over there? And then why are we bringing it over here?
What's new and what's going on with the podcast? What's happening there?
Podcast.
What's the most exciting insight you've got out of the podcast in the last couple of months?
That's a really good question.
Who's the most interesting person you've spoken to recently?
You know what? Let's actually have a look. Oh, where's my phone? Let's actually go through it.
Yeah,
and I'll give you some.
live.
And I'll give you
This is
some
live.
insights. Yeah, that's right. It's interesting. Someone asked me the other day. They said they talked about a particular episode. Remember this bit in this episode? You were talking to so and so, and I'm like, no, I can't. I can't. And you'd be like that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we create a lot of content, and the question is where it lands with other people. And it doesn't always, it's not always stuff that is on the forefront of our mind all the time.
So here it is. We're in the back of the Safety on Tap podcast.
No, we're just in iTunes.
Well, we're in iTunes. We'll tell them we're in the dashboard. So go to podcasts, find your podcast provider if it's iTunes or otherwise, and look for podcasts and look for Safety on Tap podcast.
Do you want me to I'll give you a couple of key highlights.
Go.
So one of the things that I've been doing recently is some more solo episodes.
Yep.
So in a learning by doing sort of sense, what I've been trying to do is to do my own reflections and then to share that as well. So what I'm tapping into is my own experiential learning, and then the social learning comes through people being able to listen to the podcast. So one that I did last week is called Time and Space, And it's funny how that happened over a couple of things that I was doing with some clients around facilitation and some change processes and some coaching and whatnot. And it's amazing how people one of the biggest challenges they face in solving problems, in consulting with their workforce, in engagement and culture, in leadership, is around people getting together and being able to meaningfully connect. Communicate, connect, whatever you want to call that. But there's a getting together sense, there's a connectedness. And I kind of was just sitting there going, I've got some amazing outcomes and seen some amazing outcomes with people recently, and the common denominator in there was the fact that we had created, in different contexts, the time and space for something to happen. So whether it's a senior manager who gets a whole group of people together from his organisation or her organisation in order to try and work out a new kind of safety initiative or whatever, we don't need to be so concerned about what the process is or what the outcome's gonna look like, because you've got to be able to create the time and space and believe in the time and space to allow that outcome to emerge. And that's true engagement, that's true human-centred design thinking. That also works in the context of coaching, me coming all the way out here. I'm not from Sydney, so I coming all the way out here to spend time with you is about me creating time and space in my life to learn, to grow, to share, to be challenged, to challenge each other, to create, good content like this. That's all about time and space. As much as this is an amazing production, we don't spend a whole lot of time planning it.
Yeah. Exactly right.
So time and space is one of those things.
Yeah.
Human-centred design. Sarah Pazell, a human factors specialist, was talking about human-centred design, and that's pretty phenomenal. I think that idea of actually going, we think in safety that it's all about looking after people, and yet most of the way we behave is that we push the people to the side, the people we're trying to help, and we then just plough on with our whatever it is that we're working on, and then the people are looking on the sidelines of what we're doing. I took a really good article, adapted a really good article that I wrote for the Safeguard magazine in New Zealand, and it was called From Teflon to Coach, and that was one of my early experiences as a safety person in a company that you've worked with before, which is when we actually met.
Shall remain nameless.
And it was that idea that that at one stage this senior manager I was the business partner for, said to my boss, this guy's just Teflon, and that was it. And so that person...
Say the rest of it, shit don't stick.
Yeah, it doesn't stick. And so it was a really interesting reflection on me going, well, that's totally wrong. I'm doing this about enablement and empowerment and frontline leadership and all this sort of stuff. And yet the point is that there was a disconnect between what she expected and what I expected. And so it was about closing, there's a story about closing that gap. And it was about movement on my part and movement on her part as well. And so that was an interesting journey as well. So a couple of interesting things on.
Yeah.
I've got some interesting guests lined up too coming up as well.
What's your thoughts on, I've got my own observations between Australia and the US in terms of sometimes I feel different markets, and I'm not going to say Australia versus the US, but sometimes I'll go somewhere and I'll feel like, oh, we dealt with that 10 years ago. Or, oh, wow, that's really interesting. We're not doing that. What's been your experience as you start to embark on this sort of global journey as seeing differences and similarities?
Yeah, so I think I'll draw a big contrast. So there's obviously a contrast between first world countries as a loose concept, and then second and third world countries. So I think that in that sense, often the problems like clutter, for example, so we're talking about management systems clutter, that's a real first world problem. Absolutely. Yeah. Because we've got people going to work on bamboo scaffolding in bare feet in countries, and a really good friend of mine and mentor of mine talked about how in the global business he was part of, one of their biggest challenges in one of the countries that they were working in was just getting people to wear seatbelts in cars, especially cabs. Because that was where people were getting killed all the time. So in that sense, I think that it's important to make sure that we have a bit of an understanding of our context, that it is all relative. In terms of other differences, so if we talk about places like the US, Australia, and even say the UK, a lot of people would say that the UK is kind of leading the way. But one of the greatest challenges, and they've had public inquiries into this, is around that over-bureaucratisation, where it's swung too far. And so I think there's lessons we can learn from that. One of the things that I was kind of probably most interested in and was hoping to influence, and I haven't quite cracked the nut yet, is having a look at the experience when Australia introduces harmonised legislation in safety, and then New Zealand does. And you kind of go between 2011, well, it was before that in Australia, and then in the last few years when New Zealand has, how could they avoid some of the mistakes that we're making, some of the lessons we can learn? And I don't think there's any learning whatsoever. I think that they're going through the whole same process of fear, due diligence driving fear, executives getting confused about their executive function, well, not especially and non-executive function versus management function. All of those same things are happening in New Zealand. That's at least the feedback that I'm getting from people over there. In terms of countries like the US, we've got a contrast where Australia has performance-based or goal-based legislation. So it says keep people safe, and you've got to figure out how you're going to do that. And in the US, it's far more prescriptive.
Yeah.
And so again, it's interesting where there's no one right way to do it. But what it means is that it's far easier to be black and white about what your plan looks like and what you've got to work on, and we've got to comply. It's very compliance-based in the US. In Australia, it's far harder, or in performance-based countries like Canada and the UK, it's far harder. So we kind of stumble our way around it a little bit, I think.
Do you think, just listening between the words there, do you think that maybe in the desire to have this performance-based legislation, and you can criticise the people for writing the white papers in that way, that they've potentially created this over-bureaucratic process because they've said, go figure it out, and we're not quite sure, so we write too much as a result?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's no...
Maybe Trump is a good thing.
Well, I'm not going to go there. But there's no one right way to do it. And I think the point is that what can we actually learn about it? So despite the fact that we talk about performance-based legislation in Australia, there's plenty of things that are still prescriptive. So confined spaces is a really good one. Hazardous substances is a really good one. GHS and that sort of stuff. So there are still a lot of specific things we can do. They still call up Australian standards, and Australian standards are relatively prescriptive. So in that sense, we're not totally in the dark. I think the question comes down to, what's reasonably practicable, and the sad thing is that it only ever gets tested when something really drastically goes wrong, and the guy or gal in the wig sitting in the big chair in the courtroom is the one that makes the call. And so I think what it means is that we don't have enough conversations about what that means in practice in our business, and so we become really conservative, or we just go by the seat of our pants. We're not really sure, and there are businesses that I've worked with where there's no conversation whatsoever about what's reasonably practicable, and yet that's the only thing that matters in terms of really complying with that legislation.
Yeah.
The regulators are struggling though, because a lot of the regulators don't know how to enforce performance-based legislation apart from prosecution. So an inspector will go out, an inspector in the process of efficiency, because remember they've got a system they're working to. In the process of assurance and efficiency, they're actually going to go, what can I see that looks like safety? And what they're looking for is safety work, and they're not often looking for the safety of work. Classic example, company that I was speaking to not long ago, engineering firm. They do lots of machining of big, heavy metal parts, dies and things like that. And so they'd invested a lot of money in a really good gantry crane system to make sure that they could move these things around to minimise manual handling risk. Inspector walks in and says, where's all your staff, where's your records that they're riggers, that they're qualified riggers, because they're operating a crane. And so they had taken the prescriptive requirements for a crane totally out of context and said, we want to see that you're riggers, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a prohibition notice on you so you can't use your cranes. And so this business, and they weren't a huge business, they're kind of shrugging their shoulders going, we thought we were doing the right thing here, performance-based. The regulator comes in and they did what they thought was probably the right thing to do. But I don't know, it's up to everyone else, I suppose, to make the call on whether they think on balance that was actually the best outcome. That's an example, I think, of where the regulators are struggling. But I've got I've got a good relationship with Martin Campbell, who's the new director at SafeWork SA, and he's an example of an executive in the regulators who's really actually trying to make a difference, I think, and trying to change it. Well, he's in ICAC at the moment for all of the stuff he's inherited,
Right.
but I think it's interesting, and he's made lots of public commitments about that, and so I think that's really strong leadership about them saying, you know what, maybe we've got to change the way we operate.
So talk more in terms of making that change and doing what we can do in this forum to talk about that. Let's talk more just for a minute about, so that people can understand, there's a really key point that was there a couple of seconds ago about safety work and working safely. Just talk through those two definitions for us.
Yeah, sure. So safety of work is kind of what goes on for the people doing the work. That's frontline operational safety, if you like. And then that's the safety of work. And then safety work is all the other stuff that you might read on a job description, that you might look at in a management system, that you would see in an audit or that a regulator would look for. So that's all of the audits and assessments and inspections and training and all the stuff that we do.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the distinction. Now those things all serve a purpose. They all exist. They've been created for some reason. It's just a question of us being clear on whether those things actually do relate to or contribute to the safety of work or not. And in some instances, when we create safety work, we actually increase risk. We actually reduce the safety of frontline work. So an example of that is the amount of inductions, for example, that people have got to go through will often compress the amount of time they've actually got to do a job. That creates risk. And construction sites are good examples of that, where you've got principal contractors and sometimes clients and multiple stakeholders, multiple inductions, online inductions and then on-site inductions and all that sort of stuff. So that's a simple kind of example. I'm not saying that happens all the time, but sometimes that's the trade-off, and that's the unintended trade-off. And so I think us being conscious about what is this that's in front of us? Is it safety work or is it the safety of work? And then what are we doing to contribute to those? I think it's an important question to ask.
So in terms of asking those questions, if we go, one step forward to more about what we're pushing here at Best Practice, and if we talk about culture, and this is the culture of safety leaders and the culture of leaders in general, and then the culture of the people out in the field, what are your thoughts around, if we had, there's an argument that if we had great culture and we had great behaviours, we wouldn't need all this stuff in the first place. Where's that at in industry at the moment?
Yeah. So I think one of the interesting things that this research has tapped into is this idea that culture is kind of a nebulous concept in lots of ways. So lots of people talk about it, not a lot of people really understand it, and I'm in that category of I don't know that I understand it enough in order to actually make a true difference in it in a way that I think you can actually connect your effort and the outcome. So a lot of the organisational research has actually moved on from culture, and they're looking at this concept of institutional logics. Now, I'm not going to pretend to know the ins and outs of that, but the basic idea is that we apply logic for certain things, and some of those logics are shared within our organisation. So within work groups, within teams, within whole organisations. So if we become as professionals, as systems professionals or safety professionals, understanders of logic, interpreters of logic, if we understand the rationale behind why people are doing things and why we're doing things, then it enables us to change the way we work. So an example of that might be, it's logical that we have a system that generates non-conformances, that generates actions that create safety clutter. That's logical. So if we understand that and we kind of get a common understanding of that, then we can start to challenge the logic and we can go, okay, right, well, does that connect with an outcome? And so I think that from my point of view, if we start to understand more about logics, which is the rationale for the way people work, I find that far more practical, I think, is the right word, practical, for us to kind of wrap our hands around it and understand it and then do something about it. And I think that goes to all different aspects of safety in particular. So if you look at things like culture and leadership and human error and investigations and things going wrong or whatever, I was doing some work with a client recently where they were looking at motor vehicle risk, and we went through that process of looking at incidents, and they were really keen to understand what were some of the causes and error, individual decision making, self-awareness, all that sort of stuff came up. And then I asked everyone in the room whether they've ever gotten in their car and then arrived at their destination and not really known what's happened in between. And everyone puts their hand up, right? And so I said, so it's interesting when we think about the logic that goes into us making sense of our investigations, because the very thing that makes us successful in that driving process where we got there okay is the very thing, when we're on automatic pilot, that can contribute to things going wrong. But our logic says, oh, well, someone made a decision in that. Someone was conscious about that. And so it just goes to show that we don't quite understand what's going on up here. So when we break it down into trying to understand the logics that's behind things, which aren't always conscious, I think that makes it far more tangible for us to take action on.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely, 100%. Like it is, and you can, I can think about times in my career, certainly that scenario, and then you can say, well, what sets you up? What sets you up for a successful outcome or a non-successful outcome? Is it conscious, subconscious, unconscious, whatever that might be? So, conscious, what's that matrix? You got unconsciously incompetent, and then you got consciously incompetent, and then what is it? Consciously incompetent, and then unconscious competence, something like that.
Yeah.
So I think there's all that, and that's a whole nother conversation. So tell me something. We've got managers watching this. We've got leaders watching this. We've got individuals starting to embark on their career. Once we sort of summarise all that, and you're someone who's looking after a management system, you're someone who is, working to try and, take this and, you're really, really, inspired by what you hear on the podcast, or you're inspired by what you read, and you want to start to execute and implement. What's your 3 how-tos or your 5 how-tos in terms of someone, when we first met, what would you do differently? Because when we first met, we were both a lot younger than we are today, and we were finding our way. What guidance would you give someone who's starting their journey of influence?
Yeah, there's only really one, which is get out there and seek to understand first. That's it.
Yep.
So, and I've had this question recently with people. I'm starting a job or I'm transitioning into a new safety role. Someone I've been talking to about that. What should I do? And they said, should I read codes of practice? Should I go and do some training?
More technical training.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I said, no. Go out there and understand what's going on. And that's in the context of understand what's going on in your work, understand the people who you serve, understand your business, your industry, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. But don't go out there and start to tinker. Don't get hands off. Hands off. Yep. 2 ears, 1 mouth. Use them in that ratio.
Yeah, 1 nose with 2 nostrils, 2 ears, 1 mouth.
That's right.
So smell, ears, look, eyes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's really it for me.
Yeah.
I think if we were going to boil it down, so you're going to understand the logics that are at play. You're going to understand the baseline around people's views on safety or the views on your management systems. You're going to understand the things that are important to different people. You're going to understand what drives them in their work. You're going to understand the pain points. You're going to understand why they wake up and go to work every day. I was doing some work recently with a crew in an electrical distributor, and there was a work experience kid part of the crew. And so part of what I was doing was kind of observing and understanding what was going on in reality. So not the imaginary work of systems and procedures, but reality. And I said to this work experience kid, and I haven't seen a work experience kid for, I don't know, a decade. Mm-hmm. And I was really curious, and I said, why are you here? And he said, my dad works, for this other mob. He stands up power poles. And he goes, he comes home from work and he'll stand up 7 or 8 or 9 power poles in a day. And he just had this sense of awe about telling me that. That was it. Yeah. That's why he wanted to do work experience, to do the work like his dad. So his big why, right? And I only learned that because I was curious, because I asked. I could have just ignored the work experience kid thinking, what am I going to learn from him? So that sense of wanting to go to work every day and create something amazing. Mm-hmm. So to your point, it's about going out there and just seeking to understand first. So hands off. Don't feel the pressure to go and start to meddle or change things or put your stamp on things or whatever. That's my best advice.
That's awesome. And I think my exactly the same advice, exactly the same point is find out the problem. Yeah. It's find out the problem. It's don't here's solution. I think that's that's my interpretation of what you're saying about tinkering is what is the problem? First seek to understand that the problem that you're solving. And too much of this bureaucracy and too much of all the other stuff that we're complaining that we've got now comes from solving a different problem that's not well understood.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's an example. I mean, the whole thing that we got talking about.
Everywhere.
Yeah, with the safety clutter, that conversation flowed from Kobe and I making or trying to create sense of some of the work that I was doing with Dave Proven and these master classes and the research that was done around professional identity. And I said to you, this piece around our professional identity, which we're doing masterclasses on, is great, and understanding where we've come from and where we are now, where we might be able to go. That's excellent. Mm-hmm. But that's probably not the biggest problem right now for safety people out there in particular. No. But this issue of clutter is.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the conversation starts to shift. And so I'm getting more focused on understanding what that problem is and then how, at least in my context, we can help to sort that out.
I think the question is, like, we can't solve the problem with regulators creating legislation because that's just too hard.
Not wholly.
Right now. I mean, we can vote with our feet, and you can do all that sort of stuff, and you can, companies can choose where they want to operate from.
Yeah.
Like, that's the reality, right? The company's going to go, it's too hard to operate in this climate. We're going to move to this climate, particularly now with the internet. We're going to move the whole production or we're going to start it in this place.
Yeah.
Or the ones in the more easy to operate jurisdictions are going to be the ones that survive. But someone was telling me that we're and I can't remember who it was, so I don't need to worry about too much about it, but they operated ports around the world, or they were working in ports around the world, and all the ports are different because they've got either really, really strict requirements, like if you were to land in a port here in Sydney, or it's a timber wharf that you're trying not to like bowl over with your big massive ship, and you're starting to worry, you're actually worrying, you're getting to a particular port with a ship, for example, and maybe it's a shipping company with freight, you're actually worried whether, when you put your stuff down on that wharf, whether it'll hold it. So there's the regulations here where we're operating in, the regulatory environment is so tightly controlled that I would almost argue that you've got more assumptions. Because if you were to dock a ship here in Sydney, you just assume that because there's so many regulations that your ships, like, they wouldn't let you in basically if they didn't think that their ship was able to handle your ship, for example, and your stock and all that sort of stuff. Versus you go to an environment, so there's this concept that an unregulated environment, while higher risk, could potentially get people thinking more. Because it's not prescriptive, and they're saying, well, you figure out whether when you put your stuff down on our wharf, whether it's going to break or not.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think that idea of adding more safety actually does take away from the dynamic assessment of risk. That's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah.
Whether that's a ship or whether that's individual decision making or whatever, I totally agree. I mean, we had, again, a client I was working with recently where they had some vehicle monitoring stuff that was going on, and they considered that to be a hazard because it created more distraction with things beeping and flashing and all that sort of stuff than letting them focus on the road. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I think that kind of points to that idea of going, sometimes more safety actually takes away from safety of decision making and individual risk assessment. So I think that idea, if you have a look at kind of what going back to risk, what are the critical things that are going to go wrong? And if you can actually apply those things from the higher standard context, if you like, the first world countries, then I think that having that consistency across the board is actually a good thing. So there's a balance with making sure that the safety work that you're doing is actually generalised in a way that's logical, so that people then don't need to go, oh, okay, at each different port I've got a different kind of radio call and a different way of coming in, a different form of piloting and all that sort of stuff. So I think that there's an element of making sure that you make the job easier for the frontline people to do. But at the same time, I think that you need to make sure that you're not applying just the strictest standard across the board. And that especially applies when you're using workforces from those other countries and supervisors in particular from those other countries, because you're just trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And so what you'll find is that there's non-compliance, and we'll drive control down the line, and we'll try and force these people to do that. And it just doesn't work like that. And so you'll go into a loop, a vicious loop, that again, you find that that's going on over here while these poor buggers are trying to get the job done and looking from the outside going, you guys are just full of it because we're struggling with real problems on the ground here. So, does that make sense?
Absolutely, 100%.
So I think in that sense, I mean, when we talk about compliance, and again, going back to the goal-based legislation versus the prescriptive context, so if you compare Australia and the US in that example, a lot of the compliance that we complain about in Australia is self-created, it's self-imposed. So whilst we might go, oh, we've got all these obligations that we need to comply with, most of it is internal or industry related at least, as opposed to actually specifically required. And so...
It comes back to why. That's what I keep saying. I'm banging on about this every single day. Why are we doing this?
Yeah.
And it'll be internally created. It's like, yeah, put it in the bin. Go back to your actual... And I'm negotiating a contract this morning, talking about specifically that thing in a contract clause, which is what are your legal and other requirements? What are your interested parties asking for? It's actually not as much as you think.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so I think if we ask that question of going, well, where did these requirements actually come from if they're perceived requirements, then engaging in, so the gap between we have to do it in this country and then the standards are down here and there's a gap between the two, if you're asking why, it becomes a more conscious process, you're probably going to get a better outcome because you'll go, these are a couple of critical things that we need to focus on. and then the rest we can actually leave behind, or at least maybe allow some discretion for.
So you've been doing some really interesting events lately. So talk to us about some of those. What's happening there in this? You're becoming the country's most favourite MC.
Well, it's interesting, and speaker.
Oh, and speaker. Yeah.
It's interesting. I realised in serving my mission, my big why around helping people with professional development, there's kind of this paradox or conflict that exists for me, which is that I'm trying to say to people, do less point-in-time professional development. We've talked about that before on Talking Business. And yet what I'm doing is that I'm going to meet people at those point-in-time events because that's where people are going. And so that's important. That's me seeking to understand the people who I'm trying to help. And sometimes I cause a bit of discomfort at those events around the format of the events in particular. So a couple of interesting things. At the Safety Institute of Australia conference in Melbourne, which was a couple of months ago, I did a presentation called 19 Non-Health and Safety Things to Improve Health and Safety. So the idea was using innovation thinking to say, if you're looking at a particular problem, then just do the opposite. So if we're trying to solve health and safety and the way we operate, then just do the opposite, do non-health and safety stuff. And so one of those things was in 40 minutes, I had 19 things to cover, which is absolutely impossible to do. And so I made sure that I actually said to people, deliver what you're going to promise, deliver what you promise, but it doesn't have to be literally all in one go. So don't turn the fire hose on to people. One of them was I talked about 5 principles of non-health and safety things people could do. I gave them the rest at the end. And most of those things I had done in the presentation that just hadn't come out of my mouth. So it was about the way I was behaving, not just so it's kind of like a ninja tactic, if you like. And interestingly, someone I'm working with at the moment came to me and they called me up and they said, I need you to come and help me and my team be more like ninjas. So, so that's been pretty cool. Yeah. Going to the US for the OHS Leaders Summit in October, which will be pretty cool. So that's emceeing that event, Australian debut of an event over in the US, which should be interesting because I think Australians, we've got a lot to offer in the US market in that context. And that's an invite-only event for health and safety leaders, just the senior health and safety leaders. And the best benefit out of that, some people think that it's elitist. I really like it because it enables peers to meet with peers. And so they kind of understand each other. They know the room they're going to is people who understand their perspective. And I think that's got real value in the community development context, whether that's that event or whether it's you getting together with the safety officers from other companies in your area. Whatever it is, it's about knowing the people who understand your perspective. That's really valuable. And the Safeguard conference in New Zealand, we were talking recently, I'll be speaking in 2019 at their conference, and it's on Dare to Disrupt is likely to be the theme. And they said, so what are we going to do for your keynote presentation? And I said, well, I'm not doing a keynote presentation. They're like, what do you mean? And I said, well, if you want me to dare to disrupt, then we're not going to do what you've always done. We're going to try something different. Yeah. And so that, for the New Zealand audience, that's going to be a really interesting one, where I'm pushing them and they're pushing me to go beyond just the standard talking head behind the lectern kind of presentation. And again, that's designed to be an experiment in disrupting. And you know what? It doesn't need to be the full-on, over-the-top, tech startup disruption. Sometimes it's just changing a little bit of the way that you work.
What if you did it differently for 48 hours?
Yeah.
That's all it is. What if you did it exactly the opposite way for 48 hours?
Yeah. And it's funny because they said to me, they were really emphatic about making sure that I understood that their intent around the topic was dare to disrupt. So we need to understand that there's the bit about my decision and then there's the what I'm going to do. So the daring is one bit, the way I think, and then it's kind of like the two creations, Stephen Covey stuff. And I said to them, well, I did a podcast, a reflection in the last couple of weeks, which was called Permission. And the basic concept there is that you don't need permission. You do not need permission to go and talk to that senior person, to go and try something different, to remove something from your system, to reach out to someone in your network who you'd love to talk to. Whatever it is, you do not need permission. That's often the thing that holds most people back, is feeling like they need a reason or an excuse or someone to say, yes, you can go and do that. And the thought process is important though, because like you said, it's not like you go out and you go, we're going to spend $1 million on something. That's not the kind of thing that you go out and do straight away. But you might say, well, what's a wireframe? What's a rapid prototype that we can draw on the back of a napkin and we can go and test tomorrow, whatever that looks like. You can do that. That's the bit we don't need permission for. And then you get feedback and the whole process builds on itself. But it all starts with not needing permission.
Absolutely. And piece of advice, go first seek to understand.
Yeah.
First seek to understand, then you don't need permission
Yeah.
after that, because you understand, like you've figured it out yourself. So let's talk for a moment about this point in time professional development.
Yeah.
Like, we do it, you know, we're advocating it, you're advocating it, we're trying to get away from it, but it's still there.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's still there? Like, you know, we've got these self-service systems, you got, you know, this sort of stuff, you can watch it, you know, people are going to see this in years from today.
Yeah.
Why do you think point in time professional development's still there?
I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that the education system that most of us have grown up in teaches us that, which is you go to a place and there is a person there called a teacher, and that teacher is the person who enables information transfer to occur. And you'll sit down and you'll shut up and you'll sit in rows and you'll say, good morning, Mr. So-and-so, good morning, Miss So-and-so. You'll ask for permission to go to the toilet, all that sort of stuff. That's the education system that most of us have grown up in. So that, I think, that just leads into ask your boss for money to go to the conference, and we'll go to the conference, and that's a once-a-year thing, and you feel like it's an absolute, you just have so much gratitude for this development that you've got. And when I ask people about professional development, it's like that's what they describe. They describe the thing that fits in a box, where they get the lanyard or the piece of paper or whatever. I think that's so. Our education system is one thing to do with it. I think the other is that it's easier to do that than it is to do the more rewarding professional development. So the people that I talk to who go to conferences, the most important question for me is, what changes based on what you've learned that's new or has challenged you after you go to a conference? And who asks that question? And almost no one has any answers to that. So the boss doesn't ask, what was my ROI on spending the money at the conference? Or even people who put money in their own pocket for conferences, which are getting more and more expensive. They can't tell you 12 months down the track what they got out of it. That's not a good return on investment for me. Whereas if you look at like the stuff that I advocate around coaching, for example, I can show a return based on every single coaching interaction that I have with someone, which is incremental, meaningful progress towards clear goals. So we start our coaching, it has to have a goal. It has to have an endpoint you're working towards or a problem you're trying to overcome. You can't coach without that. And so I think it's about the model. I think that's part of it too. That it's harder to do that, but it's more rewarding.
Takes a lot of discipline to do, you know, self-paced learning. Like,
Absolutely.
I've done a lot of it, and I can honestly say that it is by far, I am getting a far greater return. I'm not going to say it was easier or hard. I'm going to say it was a lot harder to do that.
Yeah.
You know, before you walked into my office, you know, before we started recording, you know, I was looking at some more self-paced, you know, professional development learning that I've paid for, I've organised it, it's done. I just need to sit down and physically get through it. And it takes a lot of discipline to carve out that time, invest that time, carve out the time, whatever, you know, dedicate the time, if you like, to doing that.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, if you say, look at tertiary studies, for example, university, you know, there's a whole bunch of assignments, but they've got a deadline and a due date. So maybe we're making a mistake as online trainers and facilitators and coaches that we're not actually providing deadlines.
Yeah.
And maybe it's I think we all agree on the problem. The problem is development more efficiently.
Yeah.
So skills and knowledge and experience that's fast-tracked and accelerated. I think we both agree that the better way to do that is self-paced and online, for example, self-paced with whatever interactions might come with that, you know, in terms of how much physical one-on-one help people need, one-on-one or one-on-many. But maybe we're making the mistake that part of the influence needs to be the scarcity, and the scarcity of time.
Yeah.
So with a university assignment, for example, the scarcity of time is you've got 10 weeks to do this. Here's your assignment day one of the semester.
Yeah.
End of the semester, there's your deadline. And if you don't do that, you don't get the mark.
Yeah.
And so it does drive a bit of fear of missing out, and FOMO.
Yeah.
But I also wonder with maybe these events have the wrong label. And this is me challenging the marketplace. I'm going to argue that they're for entertainment nature, that someone's going there to be entertained. It's under the professional development. But, you know, the most recent conference I went to, I can't say honestly that any of the presentations at that conference, they gave me an insight, but I sat, you know, they gave me insight into stuff and maybe a bit of a a prompt to look at things, but I spent most of those presentations Googling what the person was talking about.
Yeah.
And so it put me in a room, in an environment, but I was still doing my own professional development by verifying and validating what that person was saying, or researching them or their background or whatever that might be.
Yeah.
So maybe that's something to consider for you guys out there who are, I guess what we're challenging you're expecting that your professional development is, it's time stamped. It's basically, you're going to a specific place at a specific time to do specific professional development, or you're thinking like that. But our experience, I say this with a lot of authority, our experience is that our observations of people improving more rapidly, more effectively, more efficiently, and certainly cheaper, if money's the issue, is to be doing that self-paced learning.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's so the concept that comes out of one of the concepts that comes out of IT is around a sprint development. And so the idea is that instead of going through a long, drawn-out development process, you create a time constraint for the people involved, and they've got to deliver a result within that time constraint. And so that's one of the things that I've actually got in the pipeline at the moment, is having a look at how we can create a little bit of a squeeze in the process in order to actually drive it. And I experience that contrast with the two types of coaching that I do. So we do online, asynchronous, text-based, self-paced coaching, online, asynchronous, text-based, and self-paced. And I said this to someone the other day when they were asking me about the two options to evaluate them, and I said progress is slower in the self-paced context, whereas if we do real-time, one-on-one, face-to-face coaching, then we have markers. We have points at which we know we've got to rock up, and we don't want to not have done the homework or made progress. And so, but inevitably, again, it's just about understanding the mechanism of what's working, and there are trade-offs, there are benefits of both of those things. But absolutely, I agree that if you're going to do any professional development, you've got to be asking yourself about how much return are you going to get out of that, and how can you change that. So doing that in the social context, this is some of the ideas that I've got around group coaching, and some of these sprint concepts too. And I've got to be prepared to fail on putting these out into the market and seeing if we get any feedback from it. We'll learn something either way, as kind of like a middle place, if you like, to your point. Create a bit of time constraint, do it socially, make sure you're getting an outcome, and it's not all knowledge. It's not all knowledge based. It's about action.
So if someone's feeling, if you're out there in the market and you're feeling really, really overwhelmed, you're feeling like there's so much professional development, there's so much online, we're talking about coaching in work health and safety in your space, we're talking about coaching in best practice development systems here at Best Practice. If someone's feeling really, really overwhelmed, what should I do? Where should I go? What should I look at? I really don't know what I want to do. Like, I'm going to figure out what I want to do in my career later on. You're thinking all of those sorts of things. What's your guidance for someone who's just, whether they're health and safety professional, whether they're any sort of professional watching this, they could be anything, to actually get down to some nuts and bolts in sort of, what sort of professional development should I do? Like, maybe it's learn to cook.
Yeah.
What might be some, like, a decision-making flow that they can go through?
Yeah, so I've got a model that I use, I've borrowed it from hundreds and hundreds of years of Japanese tradition, which is called Iki Guy, so your reason for being. And there's a podcast episode on Iki Guy, how to find your Iki Guy. And so I use that in the context of coaching. And there are 4 elements to it. So if you imagine a Venn diagram that's got overlaps, and there's one central overlap of all 4. And those 4 elements are, what am I good at? What do I love? What problems does the world have that need solving? And what can I get paid for? And so I think all of us would love to go to work with a balance of all of those things. And this is in the work context, but even if you looked at it outside of your work, there are things that you do outside of your work that have nothing to do with money, because they fulfill other aspects of your ikigai, and then you go to your job to do the money bit, right? So it's a really good way to have a look at your life holistically. So I always use that with people in coaching to say, just reflect on what are the things that fit in each of those bubbles or those circles. That will help you then work out, where are you now and where do you want to go? So in the work context, if you're bringing your job, so assuming that you're in a job already, and you're seeking to understand and you're working out what's the biggest problems and the pain points for the customers, the internal customers you're trying to serve, you will be more successful at work if you start to work on that. Someone hit me up the other day, who I've had coaching conversations with, and they said, again, a new safety person, they said, I'm going to read lots of codes of practice. And I said, why? They're getting lots of questions. And I said, why? Like, is that really necessary in order for you to help them? Now, it may very well be, in which case that's the perfect professional development for that person. It just might not be. And so it's a question of actually asking what's the connection between the effort that I'm putting in and then who am I serving and is at the right time.
Well, how to teach your people to find and read the codes of practice themselves.
Yeah, well, that could be part of it, absolutely. But that might be great for us to say, oh, well, that's an ideal view. If this business relies on safety people to give them answers, then as much as that's not my view of how a safety function is most effective, that's appropriate for that context.
I mean, that's just the tuning into risk-based thinking. That's what I'm thinking about every day. I'm thinking like 1 quarter at a time. And so for you out there watching and listening is, you know, we do sometimes try to go a little bit big picture, and we're consuming all this content like you're sitting there consuming this content right now. Just have a think about that. Just stop and think, okay, what you know, set myself 12 weeks from now. You know, we're coming to the end of 2018. I hate to say that, but it's, you know, we just hit the beginning of September.
Disappearing fast.
It's disappearing quickly. And so I'm now just thinking about, okay, it moves so quickly, so I've got to move quickly to nail some things in this. I've really literally creating that sense of urgency for myself, that timestamp, if you like, to nail things down, because the next 12 weeks will be just gone.
Yeah.
You know, the weekend's gone, then the week's gone, then the weekend's gone. So, you know, I guess that's just psychologically how I give myself my own sense of urgency, is to say, well, I've got 12 weeks, I've got to knock this stuff off. And then I don't go too big. Yeah. Keep it really small. You got the end in mind. Maybe that could be, you know, you're nowhere near where your business plan was in the beginning. It's just think that 12 weeks ahead and just go, right, what can we knock off in the next 12 weeks?
I think that's really good advice, because thinking about my own priorities, I don't know that I've actually set myself hard deadlines on a lot of them. So
yeah, so like it's that whole self-paced approach, right? As an entrepreneur, you know, or even, you know, while you might throw the entrepreneurial label over the top of us, any individual who's got the autonomy to look after their own career, it's an entrepreneurial pursuit. It's like, well, I'm selling my intellectual property, my time, you know, whatever that might be. So just be mindful that it's running yourself like a business and just going, okay, what's my business plan for the next 12? It's the quarter. Run it by the quarter. How do I go this quarter? How do I go next quarter? That same approach. And that may see you, if you're feeling frustrated, if you're feeling like someone who's not, you know, you didn't make any traction in the last 12 weeks, no problems. It's, you know, there's hold yourself accountable to the next 12 weeks. Don't worry about the past, just get on with it.
And it's funny because I ask people that all the time. I'll catch up with someone and I'll say, how did that new idea go that you were going to try? Oh,
that's right.
It hasn't happened. So
yeah, so
maybe drink some of my own Kool-Aid.
Yeah, absolutely. So what questions have you got for us?
What's the biggest challenge for you guys at the moment?
I think the biggest challenge for us at the moment is audience engagement. We are getting our webinar numbers are growing very rapidly, and I think our webinars they are, and they're a lot of fun. We've got one in a couple of days' time in this very room, so we're getting good numbers. So we're getting, you know, the last webinar, 150 people joining us live, 150 a month live is pretty good. I think, you know, it's not the record, but it's you know, we had that big spike, and now we're just on that steady growth. Rego's numbers without any boosting, so it's not paid advertising to get more people to join the audience. So I think the word's starting to get out there that there's this great thing on once a month. The biggest challenge is getting those people to ask questions, feel the confidence that to expose themselves, because it's potentially a community of unknown people, and to get on the chat and get that question into the questions list so that they, you know, clears that blockage, because it's ultimately free. So I think the biggest thing for us is to give people the confidence to come out from behind their keyboard and ask a question publicly in that public environment, because it's not like you're in the room at the conference and you've sort of sussed everybody. It's not for everybody, but someone will go, you know, they'll feel the nerves and they'll stand up and ask the question at the conference. This is, you know, it's completely public. So I think there's a little bit of fear there where people, you know, they're a bit scared of making themselves vulnerable. If you're really, really clever, you just set up a generic Gmail that doesn't uniquely identify you and ask the question anyway. You know, just asking for a friend. So I think that's one of our biggest challenges. For us, again, the biggest challenge is balancing, you know, second out of the three is balancing all of this forward-thinking stuff with just selling and delivering and selling and delivering and getting cash in the door.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how big you are. The day-to-day challenge for us is we've got 30 people, we've got 30 mouths to feed, 30 families, 30 rents, mortgages, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm challenged every day by Jack needing to sit and put this stuff together, and at the same time, we fiddled with our software system and invoices didn't go out.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, all right, I've got to go and sort out a $180,000 problem with a database, because that can put that's like, effectively that's our whole overdraft, sucked up by a software oversight. So I've got to all right, okay, I've got 3 weeks basically to sort that out. So it's things like that are obviously a constant challenge. We are moving also to a bigger scale, obviously. So we're seeing leads coming into the business that are unprecedented. We thought we were busy last year, but with some tweaking and taking the time to focus now, with the work that Jack's been doing, we're seeing unprecedented levels of super good quality interest.
Yeah, good.
And so customer service.
Yeah, cool.
Like just ABC customer service. And for us, that's about our growth. I think we've done the work now, which I think is really good. We've done the work around internally, understanding our why, understanding our purpose, and understanding our culture. So our recruitment's going to be much smarter. Yeah. So I'm specific. I think the challenge with any business, if there's 3 core pillars to every business, and this is generic and everything plays into that, but it's the business structure that the business structure that gets set up and the business model. And it's hard to understand in the beginning, as you had the same challenge, and many people have this challenge, is what is going to be my business model and my financial structure, because you've got this thing, but you don't quite know how it's going to get monetized. And we're no different. Like, we have stuff we monetize, but we still got stuff that we don't monetize. Yeah. But a core part of that business model could be the thing that you do that you leverage to cause monetization, like your podcast, you're leveraging to cause monetization. So there's that structure, there's that core pillar. It's like a 3-legged stool. The other part is the systems and processes that we talk about that talk to the legal and other requirements, if you like. If you want to talk. Now, the other leg, which is more critical than any other leg, if you haven't got the monetization right, you're going to collapse. If you haven't got your systems and processes right, you're going to collapse. But the core leg that I'm more appreciative now than ever before is the people leg. And the people leg is all about that common comment. And I had a conversation down in the basement car park of this building this morning with a gentleman. How do you find good people? Now, everybody is a good person, but having the good people in the right place is the most difficult part. Because sometimes we have to have an unconversation, you're fired, it's time to start having conversations about you're not in the right place. Rather than you're fired, you need to leave. Because, an organisation like Best Practice tries to rehome people, if that makes sense. If you're not the right player for this field, okay, we have a big network, where can we rehome you? And so I think your work that you're talking about with your Venn diagram is really fundamentally important. But the challenge for us, the specific third challenge for us, is refining our recruitment to be more specific. Because in the past, we've been either A, too quick to get someone else to do the recruitment for us. And that was, when I say someone else, that was an internal person doing the recruitment. And so now we've got a member, an A player on our team helping us with recruitment, but she's external. And so we've sort of in the past gone, let someone else do it. I think I need to be integrally involved, certainly for the short term, for the next 2 quarters in recruitment, to ensure, until I can impart that knowledge on someone else about what culture, process, the right person on the right seat is, I think I need to do that myself. And and I think I can handle that. We're forecasting 1 to 2 people a month onboarding over the next 12 months, which will see our staff numbers double. There's affordabilities, that sort of stuff, but you've got to be really, really critical about letting the players join your team. And I think we're too quick to go, yep, you'll do. And then we spin off into all the other things that we've talked about: bureaucracy, process, system, culture, safety, the whole thing. So I think, we're not, they're generic problems. You're the same. You need a Jack, But Lexi's coming back soon. So I think that's our biggest challenge, and we're working on it. Like, it's not a challenge that's not being worked on; it's a challenge that's being worked on. But actually nailing it's going to, we're focused on it, and nailing it's going to be really tricky. Now, how do we take that and turn that into a winning formula that I then scale it and delegate it? Because I've delegated it too quickly in the past. I think it has been my mistake. And we're suffering at the moment a symptom of that process being delegated, and from a customer service perspective, we've got some people in the business that are not as focused on customer service as I am, for example. Yeah. And we currently have a what would Kobe do policy, because we're having to say, have a think about what Kobe would do in this situation, not what you would do, what you think. We've had a situation recently, and we get out and we do audits and assessments. We've had auditors yelling at people. I'm like, what the fuck? What is that? Where'd that come from? Like, talk about giving people permission. I did not give permission for anyone to do any yelling. So there's and that's a symptom of just people's, what they've got going on in their own head and all that sort of shit. It's all that sort of stuff. So it's just been really interesting to look at that and go, hang on a minute, that's not, where'd that come from? Left field, and it's a symptom of not doing that recruitment based on culture first. Has been really interesting.
So you're getting a better understanding instead of the why.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've definitely done all of the really cool stuff. Like, this is our why, this is our vision, this is our mission, and it's incredible how many hundreds and hundreds of people buy into that. But what we just went was, oh, okay, if you buy into that, let's join. Not you still got to go through a whole point. Yeah. And that's a mistake we made. We went, oh, look at this. We can attract all these people. And thinking that, oh, everyone buys into your why and your mission. We forgot about, actually, you still got to put we took the gate away. Yeah. So we've got to work on that, and everybody's lovely people, but it's just like soccer players on a football field, We just got to move a few people around, or maybe they're playing the wrong code. Yeah. So I'm being very diplomatic as I talk about this.
No, I think that's good. What I appreciate is that you're also open about that, about sharing that and saying, well, things aren't always perfect, on this side of the camera. Right. And that's part of your generosity, I think, in saying to people, well, it's not all bright and shiny, and we're all learning through the process.
And it's hard work, there's no doubt about it. Like, you see, like, I'm an avid Instagram user as much as we create content for Instagram and all that sort of stuff. But, when you talk about that, there's a guy I follow, and he's like, success doesn't come without hard work. Like, it's hard work. Like, it's hard work. Like you're saying, it's hard to get a podcast out on time. Like, you're not slack. You just got shit going on, and you just, because your business is starting to grow and you're starting to put more and more energy out into the industry, it's just, you've put the same amount of energy into the industry. It's just that they still want your podcast, so you've got to find a bit of extra energy.
Yeah, I think for me, it's understanding, the way that the podcast in itself actually contributes to the mission, my big why. And so my dad and great mentor talks about it's kind of the spine. It's the centre of the skeleton of the business and the value that I offer to the market and to individual people. So it's important to make sure that that gets looked after, and that's healthy and continuing to, strengthen, if you like. So, and that's been really useful for me, because it's easy to get distracted from doing these other things. We've all got mouths to feed and all that sort of stuff. And so making sure that we're, like in that health context, looking after all the different parts of the body means that the body works effectively together. So it's really just a case of making sure that you understand where your core value comes from. And I think that that's probably the takeaway for you guys out there watching, is that idea of understanding where your true value comes. And a lot of people, when I ask that question of them, they don't actually understand what people value from them, and how they add that value. So being more reflective on that, I think, would be a really good idea.
So thanks for joining us. Where can everyone find you?
SafetyOnTap.com is the best way to check out the podcast and all the other information we've got. Yep. And I love engaging with actual human beings. So check me out on LinkedIn, connect with me, send me a message. I'll actually reply. Yeah, perfect. Same with me. So you can find me on LinkedIn. Both of us commenting on each other's posts at night, often on LinkedIn. So look for that. So Andrew Barrett on LinkedIn, Kobe Simon on LinkedIn. We'll put the LinkedIn handles down below in the description. So look out for the Safety on Tap podcast. If you're a podcast listener, at least go and listen to one.
and they are addictive. So I'm pretty confident that you listen to one, you'll listen to them all. Absolutely fantastic. Mate, thank you for joining us once again.
Love being here.
Absolutely awesome. And we'll see you next time on Talking Business right here on Best Practice TV. Bye for now.